Hi, church. Good morning. So, I have a question for you. Do you weather storms of life well? I find personally I do better when it's like an action crisis, when there's something to do, somebody to call, some action to take. I know I've been hearing from a lot of you that this crisis, what we're in now, is a waiting crisis, and that's hard. Constant life or death, but for many it's binge watching at home. It's a struggle to figure out if your small business is going to be okay when we reopen. It's those kind of questions of waiting and wondering. So I wonder, how do you respond in a crisis? One of my favorite stories is Dylan Thomas's A Child's Christmas in Wales. The BBC did a wonderful movie version that's one of my favorite holiday classics. I watch it every year. I know almost every word. In Thomas's own words, he said this: "It was on the afternoon of the day of Christmas Eve, and I was in Mrs. Prothero's garden, waiting for cats, with her son Jim. It was snowing. It was always snowing at Christmas. December in my memory is as white as Lapland, although there were no reindeers, but there were cats. Patient, cold, callous, our hands wrapped in socks. We waited with snowballs to snowball the cats." Dylan Thomas paints this life about what it was like in Wales. And jumping ahead a little bit, he has those same little boys saying that they noticed something was burning. Jim's mom calls out, "Call the fire brigade." Well, the boys do it, saying, "Let's call the police first." Jim says, "And the ambulance, and Ernie Jenkins, he likes fire." In the end, though, they only call the fire brigade, and the fire engine comes. And 3 tall men in helmets brought the hose into the house where there was the fire inside. Mr. Prothero jumps out of the way just in time as a spray of water goes. Dylan Thomas says, nobody could have had a noisier Christmas Eve. And when the firemen turn off the hose and we're standing in the wet, smoky room, Jim's aunt, Miss Prothero, came downstairs and peered in at them. Jim and I waited very quietly to hear what she would say to them. She said the right thing always. She looked at the 3 tall firemen in their shining helmets standing among the smoke and cinders and dissolving snowballs and said, "Would you like anything to read?" It's one of my favorite lines. The firemen have doused the house that was burning apart. There's smoke, there's water everywhere, and she turns to them and said, "Would you like something to read?" I find it so funny that this woman is clearly not great in a crisis, and she's fallen back on hospitality protocol. You know what I'm talking about. At some point this week, I realized that for me and you in this world, it's kind of funny. I'm kind of like Miss Prothero. I keep saying, here, in the midst of the chaos, here's this book to read. This Bible for the great fires, the storms of life, reading. And isn't that the church? Here, reading helps a crisis. I actually think this assumed social awkwardness is what's really great about the church. I think God thinks so too, because you see that a Miss Prothero was chosen as our rock. Peter. Peter is not great in times of heightened reality. In fact, the author of the Message Bible, Eugene Peterson, once said, "Peter was a failure in ways that we most dread. He was impotent in a crisis and socially inept. At the time of the arrest of Jesus, he collapsed, a hapless, blustering coward in the most critical situations of his life with Jesus. The confession on the road to Caesarea Philippi and the vision on the Mount of Transfiguration, he said the most embarrassingly inappropriate things. He was not the companion that we would want with us in time of danger, and he was not the kind of person that we would feel comfortable with at a social occasion." And yet, friends, Peter is the very one who the church is built upon. What is seen as a saint now, if you look back, is more like the imperfect uncle at a dinner party. I would venture to say that Peter is the most human of Jesus' disciples. And I believe it's his very humanness that we can relate to right now. That this very humanness that teaches us about what church is. Church of this moment. In a time of God on earth, Peter is humanity at its fullest sense. Our Bible study has been reading the letters of Peter, and we see Peter in a post-resurrection. Peter as a leader, Peter as one with wisdom, but he wasn't always this way. I've actually decided to look at, and I posted them online for you, chapters 14 through 17 in Matthew alone. Just this small glimpse of who Peter is. Now, I intentionally didn't include Holy Week because that's a whole nother story, but these chapters here tell us something about the middle of Peter, when he's still kind of learning what it means to be a disciple. So let's jump right in. Now, storms show up in the Bible a lot, and they can have multiple meanings. In fact, there's at least two meanings that I would point out. One is figuratively. A storm could be an actual crisis, an emergency, a stressful situation, like a pandemic. A storm is a time when nature has thrown our lives out of stock. A storm calls forth God in our hearts. It calls forth anxiety. That's the kind of storm, right? That there could be this notion, but it also can be a metaphor and literal, right? This time when we feel like things are storming, right? Now, both metaphor and literally is what's happening here. Because you see, in the Sea of Galilee, there are always storms. The fishermen there, and I've been there before, and they do say that this happens, that you will be out on a nice day and all of a sudden the storms will come up so much that they might capsize your boat. The Sea of Galilee is the lowest freshwater lake on earth and the second lowest lake in the entire world. So thinking about that, it really is a unique body of water. Okay, Jesus has had a rough day at the beginning of the story. He's tired. He sends the crowd away. He tells the disciples to get in a boat. Our introvert savior needs some recharging time. So you introverts get this, right? He needs some time, so he dismisses everyone. And he goes up onto the mountainside to pray. And after some hours, it becomes night, and he begins to notice that there's a storm on the water. The waves are up against it, it says. Now, Rembrandt did a great depiction of fear in the painting called The Storm on the Sea of Galilee. You can see it online. It's one of those ones that was stolen from the Isabella Stewart Gardner heist, but you can still see it, and you see this unrest, right? So it is that metaphorical and literal sea. There's a real danger for them. But what's funny is Jesus doesn't check on them right away. It doesn't say immediately he went. It says shortly before dawn. So part of the night has passed with this storm, and he's left them in it. Why? Honestly, there's no way for us to know. Was it to build their character? Was storms something that we all have to face in life? Does it test our faith? Did he just need more time to pray? Whatever the reason, Jesus doesn't walk out to the lake until later. And now, instead of just calming the storm from a distance, he literally goes near their boat. And it says, when the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. Or saw them walking on the lake, they were terrified. They said, it's a ghost. And they cry out in fear. Yeah, that didn't go perfectly, did it? Sometimes it's true that with God in times of crises, we think God's not there. Is God's like a ghost in our lives? And when God works miracles like walking on the water, the unexpected, we don't know what to do with them. Like a vaccine that's moving at an unimaginable rate, or that paycheck protection that's helping small businesses, or a friend calling just when you needed somebody to talk to. There are miracles all around, but often we get afraid of the miracle itself. The walking on the water, because it's unexpected. And we don't know what to do with the unexpected in our lives. Those moments when God might reveal God's self confuse us. And in this scene, they terrified them. Now, Jesus senses the fear here, and so it does say he immediately responds. But Jesus immediately said to them, take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. Now, there was a whole group of disciples in this boat. And you need to remember that, because we don't always talk about it. There's a whole group of disciples in this boat. But only one responds. Know who? You guessed it. Big Mouth Peter. He shouts back, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water. Now, is Peter testing Jesus, or maybe he just wants an identification of the ghost, or either way, whatever. Jesus says, come out, and Peter gets down out of the boat and walks on the water and comes toward Jesus. Now, before we move ahead to the part people like to talk about, I want to stay right here. How many of you that are watching today would jump out of a boat during a storm? Right? The other disciples didn't do it. How many of us would jump out of the boat, both feet? There's a great book John Ortberg wrote called, If You Want to Walk on Water, You Got to Get Out of the Boat. Honestly, I think we have to give Peter some credit right here, that he even got out of the boat during the storm and jumped into the water. None of the others do it. Now, Peter is truly human, though, and at that little moment of courage gets dissolved when the waves come up in the wind. And so it says he's afraid, and he starts to sink, and he calls out, Lord, save me. Now, the whole time he was safe in God's arm. Sometimes we're this way. Sometimes we're safe, and we just don't even realize it. We keep calling out to God, and God's like, I'm already doing stuff here. Humans, right? So again, it says, immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. And he says, you of little faith, why do you doubt? And then they climb back in the boat, and the wind dies down. And people often point out Peter's shortcomings here, but at least he tried. At least he took a chance. As Pastor Mark Driscoll once said, a little faith is better than no faith. Then the Lord spoke a little faith. This means that he was capable of an even greater sustained faith. But the guys in the boat apparently had no faith, I guess. Why didn't they take a step? It does say next, though, that those in the boat then say, truly you are the Son of God. And when everything calms down and everything's okay, that's when they worship. And isn't that human nature too? That when things are perfect, the way we want them, that's when we say, thanks, God. We wait till the storm has gone. Now, Peter isn't done with the strangeness in this chapter. Peter is again very human in Matthew 15, verse 12. When the disciples come to Jesus, he has a scene about, you might have heard of the blind leading the blind phrase. And he tells them that's not really a great idea. And instead of just nodding after what is kind of a confusing message, as everybody else is doing, all the other disciples just go, yeah. They probably don't know what's going on, but they're not going to say it. But Peter does. If you like Harry Potter, he's like Hermione with his hands in the air all the time. Peter says, Jesus, I don't get what you just said. Peter says, explain the parable to us. To which Jesus says, are you still so dull? Now, being one of the kinds of people who does ask a lot of questions, I'm like, it's a little harsh, Jesus. But then I notice he says, are you still so dull? Jesus asked them. Notice that. Not asked Peter, but asked them. He realized the others didn't speak up, but it doesn't mean that they understood. Peter's just the only one with a little courage to admit his ignorance. Now, it will be that inclination to speak up that will be so important in the next chapter, in Matthew 16. Jesus is asking the people who they say the Son of Man is. And the disciples as a whole kind of feed him back what they've heard in the crowds, those stock answers of the community. Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But Peter is brave enough to speak his own mind. He says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. This man of only a little faith is enough to express it openly. To which Jesus responds, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. Now, oftentimes people say Jonah is just his dad's name, and that's why it's his son of Jonah. But I wonder if, in some ways, it's a reference to Jonah in the Old Testament, who also was a very human person called to do great things. So Simon, son of Jonah, for you, this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by Father in heaven. And I tell you, ready for this? That you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. That's the moment when Peter becomes the backbone of the church, the very rock on which it is built. Do you ever ask why? He's so human. We've seen some of this already today. He probably would not have been my first choice. Would he have been yours? I mean, why choose someone with just a little bit of courage, a little bit of faith? Why not choose somebody with great faith? There had to have been somebody, right? But Jesus chooses Peter. A fact we're going to revisit at the end. But I want you to see that was in verse 19, and just a few verses later in that same chapter, in verse 22, so 19 to 22, Jesus is going to tell them that he's not going to live. And Peter's going to take him aside and rebuke him and say, "Never, Lord, this shall never happen to you." And just a few verses, literally 19 to 22 after, Jesus turns and says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Right after he said he'll be the rock. Right after he said he'll be the church. But Jesus knows it's the humanness that comes with good and bad. I'll leave you that to consider. Instead, I want to jump onto that next chapter, Matthew 17, with the transfiguration. Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up to a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as a light. Just then he appeared before Moses and Elijah, talking with Jesus. Now this is when Jesus reveals his true self, his God self. It's so bright and light, divine revelation. This moment of great power and majesty. This moment when you would hope Peter has great wisdom or revelation as he sees this before him. But he's misprothero right here. He says, "This is nice. Would you like me to set up some pop-up tents so we can camp out?" You think I'm joking? I'm not. Listen to what the text says. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Yup. What was he thinking? This moment of great revelation, this moment when Jesus is revealing himself before him, and he's like, "Do you want me to get the tents out?" Why? Because he's like us. We want to rest. We want to reside in these moments of powerful God moments. We don't want to leave them. We want to stay. It's so much nicer on the top of the mountain, isn't it, than on that rocking sea? We want the calm, the mountaintop high, the peace, the normal. We want to rest our heads there, set up shop there when things are good. We want to forget reality for a while, don't we? And I get that. I have this sign in my room. It says, "I'm done adulting. Let's be mermaids." It sits across from my bed. Don't we all have those moments when we're like, "I've had enough of this. Let me just stay here. Let me just rest in the calm. Let me forget that there's a world down there"? Isn't that what we miss in times of crisis? But God says, no, you can't stay on the mountaintop high. You can't stay in the perfect, the good. You have to go down to the valleys. You got to go down to those lower lakes. Because that's where life is too. In the most natural of moments, we see this. Now, you would think that that's kind of the end of the section, but actually there's one more scene in this 14 to 17 when we look at Peter, and it is the most natural of moments. If you're going down to the valley, this is the moment we all kind of dread. It's about paying taxes. How normal is that? In verse 24, the tax collectors come to Peter. Note, they see him as a leader among the disciples. They say to him, "Doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax?" Now you could think they're testing like the Pharisees, but most likely they probably just want their money. And he replies to them, "Yes, he does." Then Peter is going to go to a house, it says. Jesus was the first to speak when Peter enters. "What do you think, Simon? From who do the kings of earth collect duty and taxes, from their own children or from others?" "From others," Peter answered. "Then the children are exempt," Jesus said to him. "But so that we may not cause offense, go to the lake and throw out your line. Take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you will find a 4 drachma coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and yours." In other words, good answer, Peter, but now go fish. And for his good answer, he gets a reward that whatever fish he catches is going to have money in its mouth, enough to pay his taxes and Jesus' taxes. It's kind of a strange story, right? But actually in the Sea of Galilee today, they catch a type of tilapia fish, and they call it Peter's fish in reference to this. So these are some weird stories. From 14 to 17 in Matthew, we see Peter doing some very strange stuff in almost every scene. So why is Peter the basis for the church? Why make him the model for a religious institution? Well, I could give you the easy answer and say, well, the church is also filled with weird people too, isn't it? And that's kind of true. But the truth is even deeper than that. The church is filled with humans, like Peter. Peter who's willing to step out of a boat, but not too far. Peter, who's not afraid to speak up when others are silent. Peter, who doesn't always have the right answer, but tries anyways. Peter, who would prefer the calm mountains when everything's going good in life, but has to walk through the storms. Do you see it? Do all of you who are watching know who Peter is now? Yeah, Peter's us. We are Peter. In the midst of crisis, more than ever, we realize we are Peter. And that's a good thing. In Greek mythology, you have heroes like Hercules and Jason, or for the kids, Percy Jackson, that have to help the gods out. Because there are some things that God can't do. And one is be the church. Because if the God was the rock of the church, and God was the one who comes to church, if it was a divine institution alone, then I wouldn't be welcome, because I can't live up to that. But the church is built on Peter trying to seek God. It's built on somebody broken and lost and wondering. It's built on an openness. It's a place where we can come together to praise God. Jesus was half human, and I think you see in the stories here that his humanness liked Peter. Now, his God side got a little frustrated with Peter at times, but he realized that Peter has a gift in humanity. Our frailty, our vulnerability, our courage, our perseverance. In these passages, they remind us that it is our very mortality that makes us powerful. Because life ends, we grab it with 2 hands. We jump into the water with 2 feet. I've heard it said that the church is closed right now, and I disagree. That's the wrong rock. Our church is not based on granite. Our church is based on blood and bones and hope and spunk. Church is open, it's lived, it's in you. You are the church. You are the church when you reach out with both hands and feet. You are the church when you try to understand confusing parables. You are the church even when you pay your taxes. You are the church because you are God's people trying to live in the light of God. The church is you. We might look for traditional forms, but the real forms of church are eyes and ears and mouths and hopes, and joy and peace and fear and light. It's all that humanity offers. The church is people in the storms and on the mountaintop highs. And I love that. I love that all of you who are watching today are the church, because it's a great church. And it's all in the example of Peter. But you know what? I'm okay with that. I like my church with a side of a healthy dose of social awkwardness. Don't you? Amen.